Welcome to my channel, Flex and Flow Yoga. My name is Ashley and I'm super excited because this is one of my very first videos on my channel. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about everything you need to know before teaching your very first yoga class. Okay, so you've logged the hours, you've gotten your yoga teaching certificate, whether it's 200, 300, 500 hours, and now you've finally landed your first teaching gig. Maybe it's at a studio, maybe it's at a gym. Doesn't matter, you've landed it, congratulations. What do you do now? Don't panic. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you'll need to know before teaching your very first yoga class. So why listen to me on any of this subject matter? I am a certified yoga instructor. I've been teaching for the past 8 years. I got my certification in Hell's Kitchen in New York at a studio called Sonic Yoga. Then I moved out to Seattle where I was teaching out there, then back to the East Coast where I was teaching there. And basically I've taught at a variety of different places. So I've taught in gyms, I've taught private classes for corporations like IBM, I have taught in fitness studios that offered Pilates, workout classes, and some yoga. I have taught at private yoga studios, and that is where my most recent job was at a private yoga studio in New York, so privately owned, not part of a corporation or a chain. So I have a little bit of knowledge on different clientele, how to teach at different places, the differences that exist between them, and I think I can offer some helpful tips for you teaching your first class. So let's get into it. As exciting as teaching your very first class can be, it can also be nerve-wracking, it can be intimidating, and it can be scary. Going into your first class overly prepared will make sure that it runs as smoothly as possible. My first tip for teaching your first yoga class is knowing the studio or gym you're teaching at and the clientele that they have. So as I said, I've taught in a variety of different settings, and the clientele for each was sometimes vastly different. My very first teaching job was at an LA Fitness gym. My most recent teaching job was at a hot power yoga studio in New York. So these two clienteles could not have been more different. For example, at LA Fitness, I had a wide range of ages taking my class. The oldest person I had in a class was 80. Good for him. And the clientele there was overall more novice and more beginner. That being said, of course I had people taking my classes who were a little bit more experienced, who had been practicing for a longer time. But overall, and as a generalization, this clientele was at more of a beginner-friendly level, and very different from my most recent hot power yoga teaching position. So let's talk about that for a minute. This most recent studio, which I absolutely loved and unfortunately don't teach there anymore because I moved, had locations in Tribeca and in Westchester, which are two fairly affluent places. And because of this, the cost that a client would pay to be a part of the studio is higher than, say, an LA Fitness. With that, of course, comes higher expectations, naturally. In addition, it was hot power yoga in a heated room, a little bit of a stronger flow, more fast-paced sometimes. This was very, very different from what I was doing at LA Fitness. A class that I would teach at my most recent job, I would never have taught at LA Fitness. Not only did the clientele have higher expectations at my most recent position, but the studio owner and my coworkers and myself, because we were all part of the same team, striving for the same goal. And there was a lot of care and preparation that went into teaching classes there to create a certain feel, a certain vibe, if you will, at the studio, which is pretty par for the course for studios that are privately owned. Some of them have a very specific thing that they do. So when clients come in, they know exactly what to expect with a slight variance between instructors. So to sum that point up, once you've landed your first teaching job, definitely do some research on where you are teaching. You might be provided a lot of information on who you'll be teaching and what can be expected and what they will expect of you. But if it's someplace like a larger gym, corporation, chain, you might not be provided with any guidance. And neither one is better than the other. It's just good for you to know what you're walking into. That way you can know what to do as soon as you step in that studio. So that is tip number 1, know your clientele and know your studio. Tip number 2, take a few classes wherever you're going to be teaching. This will also help with tip number 1 that I just talked about. It'll help you get to know the style and pace of the place you're going to be teaching in. At my last job, there was an audition process to be able to teach there, and one of the requirements during the audition process was that I take a few classes at the studio, preferably with different instructors. This was incredibly helpful for me. Not only did I get a sense of the style of yoga expected, but I got to see that the instructors were all very different while still providing a similar style. Now, obviously, yoga teachers grow and change and evolve to have their own style of teaching, but taking other instructors' classes is a way to continue learning and also a really good starting point if you're not exactly sure what you should be providing in a class and what you want your class to look like, your very first class. So taking a few classes wherever you're going to be teaching prior to teaching is going to allow you to see what class is like there as a practitioner and not as a teacher. It'll also help you get a sense of the kind of verbiage and cueing that instructors are using. Some studios use strictly Sanskrit, other studios prefer not to use it, and some fall somewhere in the middle. This is another really good thing to figure out before you go in to teach, and you can easily do that by taking a class, seeing what it's like, asking some questions when it's over. And the instructors will be happy to answer anything for you, especially if they know that you're a new teacher there. Tip number 3 is know the makeup of your class as best you can. This is a little bit different from tip 1 in that it gets a little bit more into specifics of the demographic of your class. What age range are your clients? What is the experience level of your clients? Again, generalization, because there's always going to be slight variances, just like teaching, right? I'm a full-time teacher, so, overall, I have a typical level of my class, but I know that I'm gonna have to differentiate for different groups of students who are at different reading levels, etc., etc. So you always wanna know the makeup of your class as best you can. Otherwise, how are you going to help them? Let's say you plan a class for an intermediate level, okay? And then you have someone who has never taken a yoga class before walk into your class. What kinds of cueing are you going to give them? What kinds of modifications are you going to give them? How are they going to know what a pose is if they've never heard the terms before? You have to think about all of these things and be prepared. So if you're teaching Anjaneyasana and they're looking around like, what the heck is that? How are you going to explain it in a way that they understand? How are you going to explain it without that Sanskrit if they're not familiar with it? Can you describe what the posture looks like? Can you describe exactly what they need to do with their right foot, with their arms, with their alignment? How are you going to get someone who's brand new to yoga into a posture in a way that they will understand? Have to think of all of these things before teaching your first class. Otherwise, it could be a little messy. And hey, there's nothing wrong with that. You keep going, you learn, you change, you grow, you do things differently the next time. But this video is to help you be prepared. So we want to know what is the makeup of the class and keeping it in your mind that you may have someone who's brand new in your class. You may have someone with a significant injury. You may have someone who just came off of maternity leave and is getting back into their practice again. You have to keep all of this in mind. So let's just narrow it down a little bit and let me tell you what I mean. So using my examples again, I mentioned earlier that when I taught at LA Fitness, my overall makeup of the class was beginner friendly and I had a very wide age range. So for a class like that, I would plan a beginner friendly class, but I would make sure that I had opportunities to challenge a practitioner and take a posture a little bit further for the few people I had in class who were more advanced. That way, the class works for everyone and they can take it a little bit further if they want to. Likewise, I would have modifications ready for anyone who's brand new to yoga or who just needs or wants a modification. But you want these things ready at the go, just in case you're in the moment, you want to know what to do. And some people are fine thinking of things like this at the spur of the moment, but I know for teaching my first class, I was very nervous and I would have preferred, and I did, to have everything planned out and ready instead of having to think at the spur of the moment. And that's just my personal opinion. Maybe you're different and you can do things at the spur of the moment like that. but I like to be extra prepared. And so for me, I want to know exactly what those modifications are. I want to know exactly what those challenges are and have them ready. Now, back to my most recent job, right? The Hot Power Yoga Studio. A little bit more of an overall advanced clientele in terms of their experience with practicing yoga. So for those classes, I tended to plan them for an intermediate to advanced level. And again, I would make sure I had modifications ready because there would be people who walked into class who had never taken a yoga class before. Me personally, hot power yoga, my first time, could never be me. But people did it and people loved it. So I would have modifications ready for those people, and I would know how to explain a posture so that they could easily get into it if they weren't sure what the pose was and were not familiar with the terms. So to sum up, tip number 3, try to find out what the overall experience level of your class is. And if you have no idea how to find this out, or the place you're teaching doesn't really have much information on that, go back to tip number 2 and take a few classes. That's going to be a really good gauge of what level of experience the people in the class have. All right, tip number 4, make sure you have a clear, concise format for your class before you walk in to teach. And I mean from beginning to end, from your warm-up all the way to your Shavasana. You also want to have a plan for what you're going to say at the beginning and the end of class. Let's say you've planned out the class, but you didn't plan out how to start or end it. You know that you're going to take your class into Shavasana at the end, but what are you going to be saying to them? Or are you going to have pockets of silence, which is fine too. You need to know. You don't want to be there at the last minute trying to figure out what you're going to say to a group of people. It's going to be awkward. They're going to sense that it's awkward. Know what you're going to say to them beforehand. And you probably already know this, but you definitely don't want to go into your first class without having actually prepared something. I mean, write it down, physically go through the class as though you're the one taking it, maybe even practice teaching it on someone at home, and get used to your cueing and your directions as an instructor. And that includes the volume, the inflection, the tone in your voice, all of it. What are you going to say between switching postures? How are you going to transition your practitioners from one posture to the next? Are you just going to say, move from warrior 1 to warrior 2? Or are you going to be more specific and tell them exactly what to do with their feet, with their arms, and how to transition? Your volume level is definitely going to be different in Shavasana than it is right in the middle of your class. So you want to account for that as well. And like I said, practice it a few times. The more you practice, like anything else, the better you become at teaching yoga. Back to going through the class as though you're the one taking it for a minute. This is super important in my opinion and helped me immensely. And this is something that I still do today and that I do every time I teach a yoga class. Practicing your own flow that you've created allows you to see what works well and what doesn't. It allows you to see which transitions are smooth and which need a little tweaking. It also allows you to see whether your pacing works for the allotted time you have to teach the class. And then it also allows you to more easily see where modifications might be needed. There have been times as I got towards the later part of my 7 or 8 years of teaching where I simply didn't have the time before a class and I planned one out, but I didn't go through it myself. Sometimes it ended up fine, but there were a few times where I taught a transition that really didn't work and wasn't smooth. I could see that people were struggling, I could see that it was awkward, and that ultimately they would have preferred and appreciated a more smooth, more easy transition. Now, had I gone through the flow myself, I would have caught this, noticed it, and then tweaked it before teaching the class to avoid that happening. If you don't have a full hour to take your own class or whatever time frame it is that you're teaching in, at the very least, go through your class and mark the motions. It's like muscle memory. That's gonna get it into your brain, what comes next and what you're doing so that it's familiar to you already. I used to do this, I still do this all the time right before I teach a class. I would just go into a quiet space like a staff lounge and just mark the motions basically for my class. I'm a former competitive cheerleader, so marking a routine is something I'm really used to. So if you know anything about dance, gymnastics, cheerleading, anything, any kind of sport or activity where you would have to mark your moves, it's the same thing. You're not doing it full out, but you are marking your motions and your transitions. Which brings me to my next point, tip number 5, write your class down. I know so many teachers who never do this and who just make up their class as they go and freestyle. I could never do that. And that's perfectly fine. Everyone is different and has different ways of doing things. For your very first class, I would highly advise writing down exactly what you're teaching. I used to use a notebook and I would just write down my sequence in the notebook and keep it next to my yoga mat while I taught, which you'll see a lot of teachers doing. A lot of instructors do that, have some kind of notes with them. Now I've transitioned that to my phone and I use just a Google Doc to plan out my class, but I don't keep it next to my mat anymore. Now I keep it off to the side of the room. Usually I use my phone for music, and so it's plugged in wherever the stereo is anyway, but just knowing that I have it over there in case I need to refer to something makes me feel much more comfortable teaching. I'm going to put just a little screenshot in the video so you can see what one of my planned out classes looks like typed up. And it's very simple, nothing fancy. Another thing that teachers often write down and have with them when they're teaching are maybe some special quotes or a poem that they'd like to read to the class. So I recommend doing this for your first class and see how it goes. Eventually you don't have to do it anymore, or maybe like me, you continue to do it because it makes you feel more comfortable, whatever works for you. But for your first class, I think it's a good idea to have something written down, something to refer to, something to look at in case you forget or get nervous or you mess up. At least you have that there. All right, we're almost done. Number 6, tip number 6, create a playlist or figure out what the music situation is if you don't need a playlist. Some places have music for you to use, some places require that you bring your own, some places don't use music at all. So ask beforehand and know what the situation is and if you need to provide the music. And if you do, what is appropriate? Do they typically prefer fast-paced music? Again, this goes along with knowing the studio and the clientele, which was tip number 1. If it's, like a hot power yoga studio, maybe they want a faster paced playlist, maybe some pop songs. If you're teaching obviously a yin yoga class, then you're going to have a very different playlist. So figure that out and know what you need. Do you just need your phone? Do you need any cords to connect to anything? Do they not have that kind of technology and maybe you need some kind of speaker? Make sure you get that information before teaching. And lastly, tip number 7, you made it. Have fun! Yoga is an amazing ancient practice that should make people feel good and connect mind, body, and soul. If you make a mistake while you're teaching, don't sweat it. Don't apologize, just pick up from where you left off and keep it moving. People will remember you freaking out or apologizing over and over again more than they'll remember the mistake that you even made. Be positive, show that you're happy to be there because you should be. It's your first class. And have a great time with your yogis. They're counting on you to have a great experience, so be yourself and give it to them. I would love to see how your first class went, or if you have any other questions about it. Let me know if this video was helpful for you. Good luck, and let me know how it goes in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys again soon.